The Sixth Dalai Lama led an extraordinarily unusual life. He was very, very different from any of his predecessors or any of the later Dalai Lamas. So he was enthroned at the age of 13 and made the temporal and spiritual leader of all of Tibet in the middle of his sort of pubescent adolescent age. Up until that time, he did not even know what his future role was going to be. So what happened in the building of the Potala Palace in 1683, the fifth Dalai Lama died before the palace was completed. And so the governor of Tibet at that time, Tsangyang Gyatso, had to actually hide the death of the fifth Dalai Lama because he felt that the whole construction process might just suddenly be brought to an end. In the meantime, he identified the sixth Dalai Lama and sort of, again, kept him in training, but it wasn't really clear what his role was going to be because at this time, the whole situation in Tibet was quite unclear. So when he was finally enthroned at 13, brought to Lhasa, made the temporal and spiritual leader of Tibet, he lived a very different life. He didn't have that kind of strict monastic training early on. And when you think about the top floor of the Lukhang temple being his private sanctuary, and when you see that in these murals are represented tantric practices, you see one whole wall dedicated to these progenitors of the tantric Buddhist path, none of whom are monks, none of whom are ascetics. They're all deeply engaged with what would seem to be worldly life. And they found that this, in all of their songs of realization, are about how the spiritual path is most quickly achieved, not by abandoning those things to which we're attracted to and those things we desire, but by integrating them onto the path, taking the body as the path, taking desire as the path. So the sixth Dalai Lama, unlike any of the other Dalai Lamas before or after him, gave back his monastic robes and he refused to become a monk. And he lived a life of a poet. Spent his time shooting archery in the back of the Potala Palace, but writing beautiful love poems. He is completely revered within the Tibetan tradition as an enlightened master, but he did not live out, you could say, this kind of monastic ideal that was otherwise expected of the Dalai Lamas. But this in no way diminished the faith that the Tibetans had in him, and nor does the current 14th Dalai Lama say that in any way this was anything other than it should have been. In fact, the 14th Dalai Lama said something very interesting. He said, at that time in Tibetan history, it was actually appropriate that the role of the Dalai Lama go back to a hereditary kind of kingship model rather than one based on reincarnation. So he said what was meant to have happened is that the sixth Dalai Lama should have fathered the son who would have become the next Dalai Lama. But because all of this was kind of political heresy at the time, the sixth Dalai Lama was kind of removed from office, as it were, at the age of 22 and went on to sort of have a mysterious life thereafter. We don't really know what happened to him. Outer accounts say that he was kind of sent off to Beijing and died en route. We don't know. But there are also the official story in Tibetan history is that he went on to have a secret life for another 40 years and ended up living out his life in a place called Alakhan in Mongolia. This is a contemporary painting by probably the most renowned contemporary artist in Lhasa today. So we included it in the exhibition simply to try to show that this is a living tradition and that the ways in which these traditions are represented is going through its own kind of transformation. So we see departures from traditional Tibetan art just in the way that the Lukhang temple here is represented is not particularly symmetrical. We see different ways in which these kind of visionary experiences that you see here represented in these abstract geometrical forms are different from what we see in the Lukhang murals themselves. At the top we see this particular form of the Primordial Buddha represented in union with the consort, representing the merging of skillful means and wisdom. And we think about the murals, all of the illustrations are from a particular text that was discovered by his direct ancestor 200 years earlier in Bhutan, named Rigsen Pema Lingpa. And so why do we see these murals, for example, in the topmost floor of the Lukhang? And the direct reason for that is although they were illustrating and depicting the most highest levels of Tibetan Buddhist yoga and meditation, they were also the direct revelation of his direct ancestor 200 years before him, who had come from Bhutan and revealed a treasure text, as it was called, that was then later transmitted to the master of the fifth Dalai Lama and to the sixth Dalai Lama, and sort of kept this as a kind of hidden, almost secret tradition of the Dalai Lamas. quite different from what we see in Buddhist monasteries based on a life of celibacy and renunciation.